Consumers are the kings and queens of the market economy, and ultimately they reign supreme over corporations and their employees. That's a quote by Perry, an opinion piece on a right-wing think tank discussing economic issues, specifically why right-wing economics places the consumer as key through the ability to move where they want. What I want to look at that kind of statement in, and the referencing consumption, is actually more sociological aspects, the historical context, because I think it's symbolic of power dynamics, a relationship between the producer, corporations, institutions which hold capital, designed to maximize profit, and a consumer, an individual who seeks materials for consumption, often to get utility. Because the core problem is actually where the power lies. Does it lie with the producer? Does it lie with the consumer? Who is actually supreme? Given that this is a problem, it's important to recognize why this is important. It's important because in our everyday lives, consumption is how we define ourselves, and it's how we express ourselves in relation to others, buying people gifts, consuming items. So the question is, given that we construct ourselves and live within a capitalist economy, the exact kind of right-wing economics, or at least centrist economics, which requires consumption to be critical to all our lives, it's important to recognize whether or not this is a empowering thing or a thing that disempowers us. To do so, I'm going to look at three core aspects, and the way I'm going to break this down in terms of where those power dynamics lie is using Stephen Luke's conception of power. So Stephen Luke is a political philosopher who says that there are three forms, and we're not going to look at it in sort of the political sphere directly, but we're going to look at it on a more micro level between those two actors as we look at it. So the three sections are, and the three power dynamics are, firstly, we're going to look at who makes the decisions. Is it the producer? Is it the consumer? Secondly, who sets the agenda for those decisions? So what's the context in which these decisions are actually being made in rather than just the decisions themselves? And thirdly, we're going to look at if there are any ideological elements at play. How is this agenda set? What are the norms in which the way in which producer and consumer operate embed certain values? When we look at these things, I'm going to conclude something straightforward, and that is that the statement by Perry is to some extent naive. The consumer is not king or queen. The consumer is someone who, at its most basic level, does have the power to express themselves and to buy items that they wish. That is completely true. So when we look at the first level of who makes decisions, that's probably true. But when we look at the wider context of how individuals consume, not just as individuals, but within collectives and groups, and we will look at the fact that producers operate in ways in which they set the agenda, and ideologies such as patriarchy, and arguably, though perhaps not, other systems such as capitalism itself embed itself through this thing, consumers aren't just the people in charge. There are greater forces at play. So who makes the decisions? Given that, on its most basic level, who has power is the person who decides what's going on, I think it becomes relatively clear that the consumer is probably the one who has power. I'm going to do two things then. Firstly, I'm going to explain Perry's argument and why Perry's argument, on its broadest sense, is accurate when it looks at who is powerful and who has decisions. But I'm going to add some nuance to that once I've proven that. And that is to say that what makes the consumers is not the same as an individual being empowered by consuming. That is to say that ultimately consumption is a social act, or at least influenced by social forces. So when we as individuals make decisions, perhaps there's more to look at than whether or not the consumer has power, but whether or not that power resides in an individual consumer rather than just consumers as a whole. So Perry's main statement, he cites several things, such as a economist named as Ludwig von Mises, who's of the Austrian School of Economics, and he blames a ruthless consumer culture as the reason as to why businesses get punished and layoffs occur. That is to say that ultimately, when there are economic issues or downturns, etc., it is the consumer who is the punisher. It is the high expectations of what people want to consume and how much people want to consume that forces businesses to respond in that way. And given that in this context, the person doing the deciding is the consumer and the whims and the changes, and the person constantly and the group constantly reacting is the producers, then Perry's argument seems to hold some level of credibility. And that credibility continues on in other parts. For example, if you look at a sort of economist or political philosopher, Schumpeter's conception of creative destruction models this exactly. Creative destruction is kind of an economic theory, kind of political theory, in that what it says is that inherent within capitalism is a destruction and renewal, a consistent cycle that is necessary for the change inherent in capitalism that isn't inherent in most other forms of organizing society and resources. So from the ashes of failures lies success, and that has that same standing, that if a business is failing, it is failing because it's not providing what people want. If it's not providing what people want, the reason why it's failing to do that is because it's not giving people the needs. So it needs to meet them, otherwise it collapses, it has to lay off workers, it becomes smaller. And from that destruction, from that freeing up of labour, and from that freeing up of consumers who move elsewhere, who have power via their feet, then you have the change that is necessary for that renewal inherent within capitalism. And that's further backed up by Austrian School of Economics in their own historical context, because when you talk about issues of freedom, someone like Hayek, F.A. Hayek, Friedrich Hayek, an Austrian economist, in Road to Serfdom says that actually it's the capitalist economy which is the underpinning of liberty, that ability to decide what you want to do with your resources, rather than a state-organized body telling you what you should be consuming, that you as an individual are able to choose and dictate the terms of what you want. That is immensely empowering to the consumer. So given that it seems reasonable that the producer is constantly responding via forces like creative destruction, and that the consumer themselves are able to exist in a much freer state of actively having consistent choices throughout time through the power of money, through the power of individual markets, then it seems that the power lies with the consumer. But just because it lies with the consumer as a whole doesn't mean it lies with the individual. And that's important to note, that there are a whole load of other social forces as to how that individual chooses those exact things of which Hayek says are freeing, right? So, for example, McCracken thinks that the way in which people choose things, similar to Simmel, is like this trickle-down fashion. So it applies to things like modern women's clothing, but it applies to anything that we really want to consume. It first gets consumed by the wealthy, the people who we aspire to be, who we wish to be, and then it's sort of copied by large numbers of other people. If that's true, then it seems reasonable to suggest that the individual doesn't have as much agency as they'd like to think, because what they're doing is they're copying what is socially seen as reasonable and normal. In a similar way, I think there are bottom-up theories as to how people could copy others. So when you look at something like the Sociology of Football by Cleland, what you see is that football came from post-industrialization within Britain, from local communities and local working class people making sport popular. Now that's been latched onto that popularity via branding, via forming your identity around football, and that's been imitated by rich people, right? Like, so the stadiums in which you see the £100 Arsenal tickets all suggest that that commodification of football is one of which is immensely like changing how other people copy it. So regardless of top down or bottom up, there are other forces of consumption which require us to look at the individual as not someone who's massively powerful even in the decisions they make, because they are copying and looking to others as to how they make that. And even within a more historical context, this still applies within not just modern consumer society, like the Arsenal tickets we were talking about, but 19th century. So Veblen is famous for his conception of Veblen goods that actually go up in demand when they go up in price, and conspicuous consumption. So there are social forces for consumers at play. And so whilst Perry is right to recognise the consumer on the most basic level makes the decision, we've got to consider the fact that they make the decision around other people who are also influencing why they make that decision. And so they are partially empowered within this section, that who makes the decisions is the consumer, but not just the consumer entirely, because there are other consumers who tell them what to do. But who sets the agenda for those decisions? Given that we established in the first section that it's pretty reasonable that an individual consumer is responding to a whole load of other consumers and other forces and fashions and trends, and we established that a profit-seeking organisation such as a company would want to sell as much as possible, it seems reasonable that maybe when it comes to how the agenda is set, that it's skewed against those consumers. It's skewed in a way in which they respond to what the producers want them to respond to. So I'm going to look at why that is likely to case, give a few counterexamples and explain why they're not particularly strong. And when it comes to how those individual decisions are made in consumer society, it is one made, dominated, created by producers. And in the confusion of the consumers, they can take advantage of it. So on a most basic level, it's noted even by classical economists that supply in and of itself is something that is responded to by consumers. That is to say, given that most people want more things irrespective of what those things actually are, if you create those things, there will be a demand for it. Which means the way in which we gear certain products probably creates some demand for those products in the first place. And if those products never existed, then maybe that demand would never be there because people wouldn't realise it. So on the most basic level of classical economists of Mill, it seems reasonable to suggest that the producer has some level of power. But in the modern era, this has gotten so much more dynamic. So advertising for itself creates what people feel that they need. It creates that need. It's not just that you're producing those items now, but you're telling people that with those items you will have a happier and more fulfilled life. And when this is applied with a whole load of psychological tricks, for example, the bandwagon effect, where people are very likely to conform and do what other people are doing because they don't want to look like they are not a team player. That's from Ash. And given that advertising creates the presence of what that norm is, what is fashionable at the moment, people copy it, and then because people are copying it, other people copy it. That means fundamentally, good advertising and a good system can be the exact way in which you're already choosing something because the agenda is set for you. So you might want that Coca-Cola, but given that Coca-Cola has spent billions on advertising throughout your entire life to make you think that this is a product that you need, and you see everyone else drinking it for that exact same reason, you yourself are not making an empowering decision to buy that Coca-Cola. That is one which has been provided for you via these psychological tricks and via standard commercial forces. It also sets the agenda for people's priorities. Given that advertising generally occurs throughout our lives, it gives us a conception of materialism. And that materialism actually fuels our desire for consuming other things. So it's not just that single advert makes you want to buy that particular item. It's also via Bush and Gilbert's theory, even within the internet age, that we consume things via this way, which makes us want to buy into the idea that that is how we seek our meaning, that is how we seek our happiness. That means, again, what we're doing is necessarily not an empowering act, but one which has been set by us, one of which we are conforming to by our most basic human needs. Now, there are counterexamples, of course. Illan, for example, notes within grime culture the ability for individual groups to create something and consume it solely for themselves, a subculture designed by themselves, and it's ultimately the consumption which is the empowering act, is the ability to express oneself, one's music, one unique culture. But even in these kind of examples, I would like to suggest that ultimately those things get weaponized when they are sufficiently popular by the producers who then set that agenda. Even grime artists like Stormzy are ones of which are now incredibly popular with the mainstream appeal and have become much more standardized in the way he approaches these things. And again, the consumer has lost out because the producer has been the one who ultimately sets that decision in the end. Even if countercultural movements consistently, even like punk, have shown that there are ways around it. There's another approach which is ethical consumerism. So for example, tax shaming Starbucks. The ability for the producer to suggest what the consumer to suggest what the producer should be doing and why. Now these can work in individual cases, and even things such as like film critics give examples of how these people operate, that consumers tell producers what they want and therefore set the agenda of what is being provided. But these examples are short between, and the reason why you should believe that is because every time these occur, what happens is people ultimately forget, they move on to different issues. But a producer always has the incentive to make sure that they are setting the agenda because they are best able to maximize their own profit. Whereas a consumer sometimes will care about how the producer operates, but oftentimes will not. And therefore, just in terms of a war of attrition, it is likely to be the producer who has the power in these circumstances. And in all kinds of approaches, they trick and manipulate us, not in necessarily pernicious ways, but ones in which we don't have power. So for example, Schwartz recognizes the ability of things such as the paradox of choice, that if we are given so many options of trousers, what ultimately happens is what ultimately producers want, which is that we just look for the single item that makes us stop having to choose between so many options. That means that everyone goes for jeans, even though the consumer could choose a plethora of options that ultimately constrained by their own material needs to choose something simplistic and what everyone else is doing. So ultimately, the producer is the one in control when it comes to the agenda. The consumer occasionally fights back, but that's not a battle in which they often win. What ideology is embedded within the agenda that sets those decisions? So this needs clarification because the third metric of power in Stephen Luke's mind is overarching systems and norms that would operate within the dynamics already established. So the interplay between the two actually highlights a sort of greater power at play. If this ideology did exist, then that would naturally be most disempowering to the consumer, because the producer is just doing its job of maximizing revenue, and it's the consumer ultimately buying in as the individual into the norms that that ideology possesses. I'm not going to discuss too much as to whether or not the ideologies are good or bad. What I will suggest is that these ideologies definitely exist, and then I'm going to look into more Marxist interpretations of what kind of ideologies could be embedded. So I think the easiest way to show that it occurs is via patriarchy. So if we take into account Polanyi's conception of embeddedness, within this context of power dynamics, it seems reasonable to suggest that the relationship of the market isn't an objective one, but one of which has subjective norms embedded into it. So when we look at something like the patriarchy, what we actually mean is that lots of women want to buy specifically designed female products for them, advertised to them, of which they create their identity through it. And this is quite pernicious in certain ways. So Simone de Beauvoir notes, for example, that you give sort of girls dolls to play with and you give boys the action hero to play with. And that sets a standard via what people want, what people should be doing, because consumers are still the ones who are taking in those decisions, but they're buying into an ideology that specifically has kept women down in the past. It's one of which tells women to be more submissive or to play with things and to look for the man as the hero. All of these kind of narratives are ones in which is actually embedded via this producer-consumer dynamic, given that that's what the consumer is expecting from the producer and sometimes what it specifically demands, and that's what the producer likes because that's what it knows. What markets and capitalism is very good at isn't necessarily creating exactly what people want, but perpetuating what people already know and expect. So when it comes to things such as what women should consume, it's looked to the past necessarily as to what those norms have already been. So embeddedness is a concept that tells you that what has been in the past will likely get perpetuated unless it's in the interests of the market. And in certain circumstances, it's reasonable to suggest that what's demanded is what's told to you, and what's told to you is what's demanded. And that means via this system, those kind of societal expectations between a man and a woman seem pretty apparent to exist and to be harmful, and certainly are perpetuated when they produce a consumer dynamic. Let's take this further then and look at other conceptions. So we look at the ability for an individual to feel a sense of meaning, what Jackson calls anomie, the ability to either be sort of nationalist or have a religious faith, some sense of purpose beyond pure utility. There seems to be a failure of modernism and a grander arching narrative to give you that meaning. According to Lyotard, the failures of modernism is frankly one which is broken down to what he calls micro-narratives, small ways in which you can express yourselves. What's important to note in terms of how that relates to ideology itself and the ideology embedded is that a consumer society is one in which fits into that postmodern conception, where we cannot define our meaning anything beyond the single items of which we have. That religion is not the way in which we can seek that meaning, nor nationalism, nor any other appeal to the dialectics of history according to Hegel. What that means fundamentally is that there are a whole load of ways in which when we consume and buy into this culture, we are disempowering ourselves from potential other narratives. That's not to necessarily say that those narratives are good or bad, but that's an argument as to how that ideology is disempowering us from seeing other approaches. On a more cynical level, Bocock notes that he thinks what happened after the Vietnam War and disillusionment in the political establishment of the US was a move towards that consumer society to prop up the legitimacy of a politic and a political system that had ultimately failed. So when you are consuming all those goods, that is a distraction to allow you to be more complicit in the kind of organizations you have. That breakdown of trust between institutions, that breakdown of grand narratives and seeking of meaning is one of which could be ideologically replaced by that act of consumption in and of itself, and that we look elsewhere for our meaning. At its worst, it seems like it's an unhappy state of affairs. For Adorno, what that means is that capitalism ultimately takes up every single thing. Even forms of protest. Che Guevara shirts are worn and bought and produced and sold and advertised as such. The ultimate acts of rebellion are still complicit and conforming. That means that people are kept passive, and if people are kept passive, then ultimately they don't have the same level of freedom as if people could conceptualize a world without that consumer society. That's a sort of more Frankfurt School or Marxist conception as to why capitalism is necessarily disempowering. And it's true to some extent that there are ways in which consumer society can make us feel unhappy and can limit our choices on the ideological sense, right? It's reasonable to suggest that pure materialism is not what makes people feel meaning, and that advertising telling people constant demands, such as what Monbiot writes in The Guardian, are reasonable conceptions as to how it hurts people. But I have no idea why that is a unique harm to a capitalist system or to a consumer society. It might be that the ideology of capitalism is embedded within consumption, given that consumption most propagates itself within that system. But it's not clear why that's worse than any other alternative, which also requires diktats from above or the inability for the individual to express themselves via micro-meanings. I'm not clear what the grand alternate narrative is, which is why I think ideology is embedded, but in some places I'm skeptical as to how it exists, and in other places I'm not sure why it would be a bad thing if it did exist, given that it reduces poverty and creates technological things. But we should be aware that if it does exist and how it exists can uniquely be disempowering. Are consumers the kings and queens of the market economy then? Not really. Ultimately, when it comes to who makes the decisions, they are the ones who make the decisions, but as a collective rather than individuals. So the way in which we're empowered is one in which is constrained by all the forces around us. It's still a form of empowerment coming to decisions. But when we look further, when we look at advertisers and how they manipulate our needs and create those desires and the ways in which it operates, and when we look even beyond that into the kind of ideologies that necessarily embed themselves when we act as consumers, it becomes a lot clearer that there is more at stake every time we're consuming. Our world has constant forms of consumption. You can't get around it even if you dislike it. And it's important then to note that it's not entirely an empowering act. That's not to say that it's the worst act imaginable. It still provides for us, it still caters to our needs. But it's certainly one where we have to recognise on a large set of issues we are ultimately disempowered and at worst manipulated